Hi everyone, this is Robert. Welcome to The Well-Told Tale. Every week we bring you the finest science fiction and fantasy stories ever written. We have reached part 9 of The First Men in the Moon by H.G. Wells. Our intrepid explorers Mr. Bedford and Mr. Cavour have escaped their captors, the Selenites, and are desperately trying to head back up to the surface in the hope they might be able to find their spaceship, the Sphere. Though now they can hear the sounds of pursuit. Will they make it? It's time to pull up a chair, relax and enjoy part 9 of The First Men in the Moon by H.G. Wells. 17. The Fight in the Cave of the Moon Butchers. I do not know how far we clambered before we came to the grating. It may be we ascended only a few hundred feet, but at the time it seemed to me we might have hauled and jammed and hopped and wedged ourselves through a mile or more of vertical ascent. Whenever I recall that time, there comes into my head the heavy clank of our golden chains that followed every movement. Very soon my knuckles and knees were raw and I had a bruise on one cheek. After a time, the first violence of our efforts diminished and our movements became more deliberate and less painful. The noise of the pursuing Selenites had died away altogether. It seemed almost as though they had not traced us up the crack after all, in spite of the telltale heap of broken fungi that must have lain beneath it. At times the cleft narrowed so much that we could scarce squeeze up it. At others it expanded into great druzy cavities, studded with prickly crystals or thickly beset with dull shining fungoid pimples. Sometimes it twisted spirally, and at other times it slanted down nearly to the horizontal direction. Ever and again there was the intermittent drip and trickle of water by us. Once or twice it seemed to us that small living things had rustled out of our reach, but what they were we never saw. They may have been venomous beasts for all I know, but they did us no harm, and we were now tuned to a pitch when a weird creeping thing more or less mattered little. And at last, far above, came the familiar bluish light again, and then we saw that it filtered through a grating that barred our way. We whispered as we pointed this out to one another, and became more and more cautious in our ascent. Presently we were close under the grating, and by pressing my face against its bars, I could see a limited portion of the cavern beyond. It was clearly a large space, and lit no doubt by some rivulet of the same blue light that we had seen flow from the beating machinery. An intermittent trickle of water dropped ever and again between the bars near my face. My first endeavour was naturally to see what might be upon the floor of the cavern, but our grating lay in a depression whose rim hid all this from our eyes. Our foiled attention then fell back upon the suggestion of the various sounds we heard, and presently my eye caught a number of faint shadows that played across the dim roof far overhead. Indisputably, there were several Selenites, perhaps a considerable number in this space, for we could hear the noises of their intercourse and faint sounds that I identified as their footfalls. There was also a succession of regularly repeated sounds, chid, 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 which began and ceased, suggestive of a knife or spade hacking at some soft substance. Then came a clank as if of some chains, a whistle and a rumble as of a truck running over a hollowed place. And then again that chid, chid, chid resumed. The shadows told of shapes that moved quickly and rhythmically, in agreement with that regular sound, and rested when it ceased. We put our heads close together and began to discuss the things in noiseless whispers. "They are occupied," I said. "They are occupied in some way." "Yes. They're not seeking us or thinking of us. Perhaps they have not heard of us. Those others are hunting about below. If suddenly we appeared here—" We looked at one another. "There might be a chance to parley," said Cavour. "No," I said, "not as we are." For a space we remained, each occupied by his own thoughts. Chid, chid, chid went the chipping, and the shadows moved to and fro. I looked at the grating. "It's flimsy," I said. "We might bend 2 of the bars and crawl through." We wasted a little time in vague discussion. Then I took one of the bars in both hands and got my feet against the rock until they were almost on a level with my head, and so thrust against the bar. It bent so suddenly that I almost slipped. I clambered about and bent the adjacent bar in the opposite direction, and then took the luminous fungus from my pocket and dropped it down the fissure. "Don't do anything hastily," whispered Cavour, as I whispered myself up through the opening I had enlarged. I had a glimpse of busy figures as I came through the grating, and immediately bent down so that the rim of the depression in which the grating lay hid me from their eyes, and so lay flat, signalling advice to Cavour as he also prepared to come through. Presently, we were side by side in the depression, peering over the edge at the cavern and its occupants. It was a much larger cavern than we had supposed from our first glimpse of it, and we looked up from the lowest portion of its sloping floor. It widened out as it receded from us, and its roof came down and hid the remoter portion altogether. And lying in a line along its length, vanishing at last far away in that tremendous perspective, were a number of huge shapes, huge pallid hulls upon which the Selenites were busy. At first they seemed big white cylinders of vague import. Then I noted the heads upon them lying towards us, eyeless and skinless like the heads of sheep at a butcher's, and perceived that they were the carcasses of moon calves being cut up, much as the crew of a whaler might cut up a moored whale. They were cutting off the flesh in strips, and on some of the further trunks the white ribs were showing. It was the sound of their hatchets that made that chid, chid, chid. Some way away, a thing like a trolley cable, drawn and loaded with chunks of lax meat, was running up the slope of the cavern floor. This enormous long avenue of hulls that were destined to be food gave us a sense of the vast populousness of this moon world, second only to the effect of our first glimpse down the shaft. It seemed to me at first that the Selenites might be standing on trestle-supported planks, and then I saw that the planks and supports and the hatchets were really of the same leaden hue as my fetters had seemed before white light came to bear on them. A number of very thick-looking crowbars lay about the floor, and had apparently assisted to turn the dead mooncalf over on its side. They were perhaps 6 feet long, with shaped handles, very tempting-looking weapons. The whole place was lit by 3 transverse streams of the blue fluid. We lay for a long time, noting all these things in silence. "Well," said Cavour at last. I crouched over and turned to him. I had come upon a brilliant idea. "Unless they lowered those bodies by a crane," I said, "we must be nearer the surface than I thought." "Why?" "The mooncalf doesn't hop, and it hasn't got wings." He peered over the edge of the hollow again. "I wonder now," he began. "After all, we have never gone far from the surface." I stopped him by a grip on his arm. I had heard a noise from the cleft below us. We twisted ourselves about and lay as still as death, with every sense alert. In a little while I did not doubt that something was quietly ascending the cleft. Very slowly and quite noiselessly, I assured myself of a good grip on my chain and waited for that something to appear. "Just look at those chaps with the hatchets again," I said. "They're all right," said Cavour. I took a sort of provisional aim at the gap in the grating. I could hear now quite distinctly the soft twittering of the ascending Selenites, the dab of their hands against the rock and the falling of dust from their grips as they clambered. Then I could see that there was something moving dimly in the blackness below the grating, but what it might be I could not distinguish. The whole thing seemed to hang fire for just a moment. Then, smash! I had sprung to my feet, struck savagely at something that had flashed out at me. It was the keen point of a spear. I have thought since that its length in the narrowness of the cleft must have prevented it being sloped to reach me. However, it shot out from the grating like the tongue of a snake and missed and flew back and flashed again. But the second time I snatched and caught it and wrenched it away, but not before another had darted ineffectually at me. I shouted with triumph as I felt the hold of the Selenite resist my pull for a moment and give, and then I was jabbing down through the bars amidst squeals from the darkness, and Cavour had snapped off the other spear and was leaping and flourishing it beside me and making inefficient jabs. Clang, clang came up through the grating, and then an axe hurtled through the air and whacked against the rocks beyond to remind me of the fleshers at the carcasses up the cavern. I turned, and they were all coming towards us in open order, waving their axes. They were short, thick little beggars, with long arms, strikingly different from the ones we had seen before. If they had not heard of us before, they must have realised the situation with incredible swiftness. I stared at them for a moment, spear in hand. "Guard that grating, Cavour," I cried, howled to intimidate them, and rushed to meet them. 2 of them missed with their hatchets, and the rest fled incontinently. Then the 2 were also sprinting away up the cavern, with hands clenched and heads down. I never saw men run like them. I knew the spear I had was no good for me. It was thin and flimsy, only effectual for a thrust and too long for a quick recover, so I only chased the Selenites as far as the first carcass, and then stopped there and picked up one of the crowbars that were lying about. It felt comfortingly heavy, and equal to smashing any number of Selenites. I threw away my spear and picked up a second crowbar for the other hand. I felt 5 times better than I had with the spear. I shook the two threateningly at the Selenites, who had come to a halt in the little crowd far away up the cavern, and then turned about to look at Cavour. He was leaping from side to side of the grating, making threatening jabs with his broken spear. That was all right. It would keep the Selenites down, for a time at any rate. I looked up at the cavern again. What on earth were we going to do now? We were cornered in a sort of way already, but these butchers up the cavern had been surprised. They were probably scared, and they had no special weapons, only those little hatchets of theirs, and that way lay escape. Their sturdy little forms, ever so much shorter and thicker than the moo-calf herds, were scattered up the slope in a way that was eloquent of indecision. I had the moral advantage of a mad bull in a street, but for all that, there seemed a tremendous crowd of them. Very probably there were. Those Selenites down the cleft had certainly some infernally long spears. It might be they had other surprises for us, but confound it. If we charged up the cave, we should let them up behind us, and if we didn't, those little brutes up the cave would probably get reinforced. Heaven alone knew what tremendous engines of warfare, guns, bombs, terrestrial torpedoes, this unknown world beneath our feet, this vaster world of which we had only pricked the outer cuticle, might not presently send up to our destruction. It became clear that the only thing to do was charge. It became clearer as the legs of a number of fresh Selenites appeared running down the cavern towards us. "Bedford!" cried Cavour, and behold, he was halfway between me and the grating. "Go back!" I cried. "What are you doing? They've got... It's like a gun!" And struggling in the grating between those defensive spears appeared the head and shoulders of a singularly lean and angular Selenite, bearing some complicated apparatus. I realised Cavour's utter incapacity for the fight we had in hand. For a moment, I hesitated. Then I rushed past him, whirling my crowbars and shouting to confound the aim of the Selenite. He was aiming in the queerest way with the thing against his stomach. Chuzz! The thing wasn't a gun. It went off like a crossbow more and dropped me in the middle of a leap. I didn't fall down. I simply came down a little shorter than I should have done if I hadn't been hit, and from the feel of my shoulder, the thing might have tapped me and glanced off. Then my left hand hit against the shaft, and I perceived there was a sort of spear sticking half through my shoulder. The moment after, I got home with the crowbar in my right hand and hit the Selenite fair and square. He collapsed, he crushed and crumpled, his head smashed like an egg. I dropped a crowbar, pulled the spear out of my shoulder and began to jab it down the grating into the darkness. At each jab came a shriek and a twitter. Finally, I hurled the spear down upon them with all my strength, leapt up, picked up the crowbar again, and started for the multitude up the cavern. "Bedford!" cried Cavour. "Bedford!" as I flew past him. I seemed to remember his footsteps coming on behind me. Step, leap, whack, step, leap. Each leap seemed to last ages. With each, the cave opened out and the number of Selenites visibly increased. At first, they seemed all running about like ants in a disturbed anthill, one or two waving hatchets and coming to meet me, more running away, some bolting sideways into the avenue of carcasses. Then presently others came into sight, carrying spears, and then others. I saw a most extraordinary thing, all hands and feet bolting for cover. The cavern drew darker further up. Flick! Something flew over my head. Flick! As I soared in mid-stride, I saw a spear hit and quiver in one of the carcasses to my left. Then, as I came down, one hit the ground before me, and I heard the remote chuzz with which their things were fired. Flick! Flick! For a moment it was a shower. They were volleying. I stopped dead. I don't think I thought clearly then. I seem to remember a kind of stereotyped phrase running through my mind. "Zone of fire, seek cover." I know I made a dash for the space between two of the carcasses and stood there panting and feeling very wicked. I looked around for Cavour, and for a moment it seemed as if he had vanished from the world. Then he came out of the darkness between the row of the carcasses and the rocky wall of the cavern. I saw his little face, dark and blue and shining with perspiration and emotion. He was saying something, but what it was I did not heed. I had realised that we might work from mooncalf to mooncalf up the cave until we were near enough to charge home. It was charge or nothing. "Come on," I said, and led the way. "Bedford!" he cried unavailingly. My mind was busy as we went up that narrow alley between the dead bodies and the wall of the cavern. The rocks curved about. They could not enfilade us, though in that narrow space we could not leap. Yet with our earthborn strength we were still able to go very much faster than the Selenites. I reckoned we should presently come right among them. Once we were on them, they would be nearly as formidable as black beetles. Only there would first of all be a volley. I thought of a stratagem. I whipped off my flannel jacket as I ran. "Bedford!" panted Cavour behind me. I glanced back. "What?" said I. He was pointing upward over the carcasses. "White light!" he said. "White light again!" I looked, and it was even so, a faint white ghost of light in the remoter cavern roof. That seemed to give me double strength. "Keep close," I said. A flat, long Selenite dashed out of the darkness and squealed and fled. I halted and stopped Cavour with my hand. I hung my jacket over my crowbar, ducked round the next carcass, dropped jacket and crowbar, showed myself and darted back. Chuzz flick. Just one arrow came. We were close on the Selenites, and they were standing in a crowd, broad, short and tall together, with a little battery of their shooting implements pointed down the cave. 3 or 4 other arrows followed the first, and then their fire ceased. I stuck out my head and escaped by a hair's breadth. This time I drew a dozen shots or more, and heard the Selenites shouting and twittering as if with excitement as they shot. I picked up my jacket and crowbar again. "Now," said I, and thrust out the jacket. Chuzz, chuzz. In an instant my jacket had grown a thick beard of arrows, and they were quivering all over the carcass behind us. Instantly I slipped the crowbar out of the jacket, dropped the jacket, for all I know to the contrary it is lying up there in the moon now, and rushed out upon them. For a minute perhaps it was a massacre. I was too fierce to discriminate, and the Selenites were probably too scared to fight. At any rate, they made no sort of fight against me. I saw scarlet, as the saying is. I remember I seemed to be wading among those leathery thin things as a man wades through tall grass, mowing and hitting, first right, then left, smash. Little drops of moisture flew about. I trod on things that crushed and piped and went slippery. The crowd seemed to open and close and flow like water. They seemed to have no combined plan whatever. Their spears flew about me. I was grazed over the ear by one. I was stabbed once in the arm and once in the cheek, but I only found out that afterwards, when the blood had had time to run and cool and feel wet. What Cavour did, I do not know. For a space it seemed that this fighting had lasted for an age and must needs go on forever. Then suddenly it was all over, and there was nothing to be seen but the backs of heads bobbing up and down as their owners ran in all directions. I seemed altogether unhurt. I ran forward some paces, shouting, and then turned about. I was amazed. I had come right through them in vast flying strides. They were all behind me, and running hither and thither to hide. I felt an enormous astonishment at the evaporation of the great fight into which I had hurled myself, and not a little exultation. It did not seem to me that I had discovered the Selenites were unexpectedly flimsy, but that I was unexpectedly strong. I laughed stupidly. This fantastic moon! I glanced for a moment at the smashed and writhing bodies that were scattered over the cavern floor with a vague idea of further violence, and then hurried on after Cavour. 18. In the sunlight. Presently we saw that the cavern before us opened upon a hazy void. In another moment we had emerged upon a sort of slanting gallery that projected into a vast circular space, a huge cylindrical pit running vertically up and down. Round this pit, the slanting gallery ran without any parapet or protection for a turn and a half, and then plunged high above into the rock again. Somehow it reminded me then of one of those spiral turns of the railway through the Saint-Gothard. It was all tremendously huge. I can scarcely hope to convey to you the titanic proportion of that place, the titanic effect of it. Our eyes followed up the vast declivity of the pit wall, and overhead and far above we beheld a round opening set with faint stars, and half of the lip about it well-nigh blinding with the white light of the sun. At that we cried aloud simultaneously. "Come on," I said, leading the way. "But there," said Cavour, and very carefully stepped nearer the edge of the gallery. I followed his example and craned forward and looked down, but I was dazzled by that gleam of light above, and I could only see a bottomless darkness with spectral patches of crimson and purple floating therein. Yet if I could not see, I could hear. Out of this darkness came a sound like the angry hum one can hear if one puts one's ear outside a hive of bees, a sound out of that enormous hollow, it may be, 4 miles beneath our feet. For a moment I listened, then tightened my grip on my crowbar and led the way up the gallery. "This must be the shaft we looked down upon," said Cavour, "under that lid. And below us is where we saw the lights." "The lights," he said. "Yes, the lights of the world that now we shall never see." "We'll come back," I said, for now we had escaped so much I was rashly sanguine that we should recover the sphere. His answer I did not catch. "Eh?" I asked. "It doesn't matter," he answered, and we hurried on in silence. I suppose that slanting lateral way was 4 or 5 miles long, allowing for its curvature, and it ascended at a slope that would have made it almost impossibly steep on Earth, but which one strode up easily under lunar conditions. We saw only 2 Selenites during all that portion of our flight, and directly they became aware of us, they ran headlong. It was clear that the knowledge of our strength and violence had reached them. Our way to the exterior was unexpectedly plain. The spiral gallery straightened into a steeply ascendant tunnel, its floor bearing abundant traces of the mooncalves, and so straight and short in proportion to its vast arch that no part of it was absolutely dark. Almost immediately it began to lighten, and then far off and high up and quite blindingly brilliant appeared its opening on the exterior, a slope of alpine steepness surmounted by a crest of bayonet shrub, tall and broken down now, and dry and dead in spiky silhouette against the sun. And it is strange that we men, to whom this very vegetation had seemed so weird and horrible a little time ago, should now behold it with the emotion a homecoming exile might feel at the sight of his native land. We welcomed even the rareness of the air that made us pant as we ran, and which rendered speaking no longer the easy thing it had been, but an effort to make oneself heard. Larger the sunlit circle above us, and larger, and all the nearer tunnel sank into a rim of indistinguishable black. We saw the dead bayonet shrub no longer with any touch of green in it, but brown and dry and thick, and the shadow of its upper branches high out of sight made a densely interlaced pattern upon the tumbled rocks, and at the immediate mouth of the tunnel was a wide trampled space where the mooncalves had come and gone. We came out upon this space at last into a light and heat that hit and pressed upon us. We traversed the exposed area painfully and clambered up a slope among the scrub stems and sat down at last panting in a high place beneath the shadow of a mass of twisted lava. Even in the shade the rock felt hot. The air was intensely hot, and we were in great physical discomfort, but for all that we were no longer in a nightmare. We seemed to have come to our own province again, beneath the stars. All the fear and stress of our flight through the dim passages and fissures below had fallen from us. That last fight had filled us with an enormous confidence in ourselves, so far as the Selenites were concerned. We looked back almost incredulously at the black opening from which we had just emerged. Down there it was, in a blue glow that now in our memories seemed the next thing to absolute darkness. We had met with things like mad mockeries of men, helmet-headed creatures, and had walked in fear before them, and had submitted to them, until we could submit no longer. And behold, they had smashed like wax, and scattered like chaff, and fled and vanished like the creatures of a dream. I rubbed my eyes, doubting whether we had not slept and dreamt those things by reason of the fungus we had eaten, and suddenly discovered the blood upon my face, and then that my shirt was sticking painfully to my shoulder and arm. "Oh, confound it!" I said, gauging my injuries with an investigatory hand, and suddenly that distant tunnel mouth became, as it were, a watching eye. Cavour, I said, what are they going to do now, and what are we going to do? He shook his head with his eyes fixed upon the tunnel. How can one tell what they will do? It depends on what they think of us, and I don't see how we can begin to guess that, and it depends upon what they have in reserve. It's, as you say, Cavour, we have touched the merest outside of this world. They may have all sorts of things inside here. Even with those shooting things, they might make it bad for us. Yet, after all, I said, even if we don't find the sphere at once, there is a chance for us. We might hold out, even through the night. We might go down there again and make a fight for it. I stared about me with speculative eyes. The character of the scenery had altered altogether by reason of the enormous growth and subsequent dying of the scrub. The crest on which we sat was high and commanded a wide prospect of the crater landscape, and we saw it now all sere and dry in the late autumn of the lunar afternoon. Rising one behind the other were long slopes and fields of trampled brown where the mooncalves had pastured, and far away in the full blaze of the sun, a drove of them basked slumberously, scattered shapes, each with a blot of shadow against it like sheep on the side of a down. But never a sign of a Selenite was to be seen. Whether they had fled on our emergence from the interior passages, or whether they were accustomed to retire after driving out the mooncalves, I cannot guess. At the time, I believed the former was the case. If we were to set fire to all this stuff, I said, we might find the sphere among the ashes. Cavour did not seem to hear me. He was peering under his hand at the stars that still, in spite of the intense sunlight, were abundantly visible in the sky. How long do you think we've been here? He asked at last. Been where? On the moon? 2 earthly days, perhaps? More like 10. Do you know, the sun is past its zenith and sinking in the west. In 4 days' time or less it will be night. But we've only eaten once. I know that, but there are the stars. Why should time seem different because we're on a smaller planet? I don't know. There it is. How does one tell time? Hunger, fatigue, all those things are different. Everything is different, everything. To me it seems that since we first came out of the sphere has only been a question of hours, long hours at most. 10 days, I said. That leaves... I looked up at the sun for a moment and then saw that it was halfway from the zenith to the western edge of things. 4 days? Cavour, we mustn't sit here and dream. How do you think we may begin? I stood up. We must get a fixed point we can recognise. We must hoist a flag or a handkerchief or something and quarter the ground and work round that. He stood up beside me. Yes, he said, there is nothing for it but to hunt the sphere. Nothing. We may find it, certainly we may find it, and if not, we must keep looking. He looked this way and that, glanced up at the sky and down at the tunnel, and astonished me by a sudden gesture of impatience. Oh, but we have done foolishly to have come to this pass. Think how it might have been, and the things that we might have done. We might do something yet. Never the thing we might have done. Here below our feet is a world. Think of what that world must be. Think of that machine we saw, and the lid and the shaft. They were just remote, outlying things, and those creatures we have seen and fought with no more than ignorant peasants, dwellers in the outskirts, yokels and labourers half akin to brutes. Down below, caverns beneath caverns, tunnels, structures, ways. It must open out and be greater and wider and more populous as one descends. Assuredly. Right down at the last, the central sea that washes round the core of the moon. Think of its inky waters under the spare lights, if indeed their eyes need lights. Think of the cascading tributaries pouring down their channels to feed it. Think of the tides upon its surface and the rush and the swirl of its ebb and flow. Perhaps they have ships that go upon it. Perhaps down there are mighty cities and swarming ways, and wisdom and order passing the wit of man, and we may die here upon it and never see the masters who must be ruling over these things. We may freeze and die here, and the air will freeze and thaw upon us, and then they will come upon us, come upon our stiff and silent bodies, find the sphere we cannot find, and they will understand at last, too late, all the thought and effort that ended here in vain. His voice, for all that speech, sounded like the voice of someone heard in a telephone, weak and far away. But the darkness, I said, one must get over that. How? I don't know. How am I to know? One might carry a torch, one might have a lamp, The others might understand. He stood for a moment with his hands held down and a rueful face, staring out over the waste that defied him. Then, with a gesture of renunciation, he turned towards me with proposals for the systematic hunting of the sphere. We can return, I said. He looked about him. First of all, we shall have to get to Earth. We could bring the lamps to carry and climbing irons and 100 necessary things. Yes, he said, we can take back an earnest of success in this gold. He looked at my golden crowbars and said nothing for a space. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, staring across the crater. At last he signed and spoke. It was I found the way here, but to find a way isn't always to be a master of a way. If I take my secret back to Earth, what will happen? I do not see how I can keep my secret for a year, for even part of a year. Sooner or later it must come out, even if other men discover it, and then governments and powers will struggle to get hither. They will fight against one another and against these moon people. It will only spread warfare and multiply the occasions of war. In a little while, in a very little while, if I tell my secret, this planet to its deepest galleries will be strewn with human dead. Other things are doubtful, but that is certain. It is not as though man has had any use for the moon. What good would the moon be to men? Even of their own planet, what have they made but a battleground and theatre of infinite folly? Small as his world is, and short as his time, he has still in his little life down there far more than he can do. No, science has toiled too long forging weapons for fools to use. It is time she held her hand. Let him find out for himself again in 1,000 years' time. There are methods of secrecy, I said. He looked up at me and smiled. After all, he said, why should one worry? There is little chance of our finding the sphere, and down below things are brewing. It's simply the human habit of hoping till we die that makes us think of return. Our troubles are only beginning. We have shown these moonfolk violence, we have given them a taste of our quality, and our chances are about as good as a tiger's that got loose and killed a man in Hyde Park. The news of us must be running down from gallery to gallery towards the central parts. No sane beings will ever let us take that sphere back to Earth after so much as they have seen of us. We aren't improving our chances, said I, by sitting here. We stood up side by side. After all, he said, we must separate. We must stick up a handkerchief on these tall spikes here and fasten it firmly, and from this as a centre we must work over the crater. You must go westwards, working out in semicircles, to and fro towards the setting sun. You must move first with your shadow on your right until it is at right angles with the direction of your handkerchief, and then with the shadow on your left. And I will do the same to the east. We will look into every gully, examine every skerry of rocks. We will do all we can to find my sphere. If we see the Selenites, we will hide from them as well as we can. For drink, we must take snow, and if we feel the need of food, we must kill a moon calf if we can, and eat such flesh as it has, raw. And so each will go his own way. And if one of us comes upon the sphere, he must come back to the white handkerchief and stand by it and signal to the other. And if neither, Cavour glanced up at the sun, we go on seeking until the night and cold overtake us. Suppose the Selenites have found the sphere and hidden it. He shrugged his shoulders. Or if presently they come hunting us. He made no answer. You had better take a club, I said. He shook his head and stared away from me across the waste. But for a moment he did not start. He looked round at me shyly, hesitated. Au revoir, he said. I felt an odd stab of emotion. A sense of how we had galled each other, and particularly how I must have galled him, came to me. Confound it, thought I. We might have done better. I was on the point of asking him to shake hands, for that somehow was how I felt just then, when he put his feet together and leaped away from me towards the north. He seemed to drift through the air as a dead leaf would do, fell lightly and leapt again. I stood for a moment watching him, then faced westward reluctantly, pulled myself together, and with something of the feeling of a man who leaps into icy water, selected a leaping point and plunged towards it to explore my solitary half of the moon world. I dropped rather clumsily among rocks, stood up and looked about me, clambered onto a rocky slab and leapt again. When presently I looked for Cavour, He was hidden from my eyes, but the handkerchief showed out bravely on its headland, white in the blaze of the sun. I determined not to lose sight of that handkerchief, whatever may betide. And welcome back. I hope you enjoyed part 9 of The First Men in the Moon. If you'd like to support The Well Told Tale as we make these classics available for free to everyone, thank you. The best way to do that is through my Patreon page. There's a link in the description. I'll be back next week with part 10 of the story. I hope you can join me.